Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants are on a listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Linda Lee from the U.S. Census Bureau. Linda, you may begin.
Thank you, Anthony. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We will save all our questions to the end of the presentation. Please add your questions into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner, and we will read them out loud after the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees at this time. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the November Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, we welcome Andrew Foote as he presents Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes, PSEO, the Past, the Present, and the Future. Recently, the U.S. Census Bureau released data for institutions from 6 new data partners in the PSEO experimental data product. PSEO now includes data on 825 institutions, which cover more than 29% of all college graduates in the United States in 2015. PSEO is an experimental data product generated by linking graduate transcript records to LEHD data on graduates of participating post-secondary institutions in the United States. PSEO Explorer has been updated to display data for these new institutions. Andrew Foote is a principal economist for the LEHD program in the Census Bureau's Center for Economic Studies and serves as the lead researcher for the post-secondary employment outcomes. His research focuses on worker transitions following job loss and labor market outcomes for graduates, and how these differ based on local labor demand conditions. Foote received a PhD from the University of California, Davis in 2015. With that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for joining for this webinar. I'm going to talk about the post-secondary employment outcomes, which I'll refer to as PSEO from now on. We'll talk a little bit about how the partnership was formed, the data that we release now, and then looking forward to what PSEO 2.0 is going to look like as we continue to enhance the earnings records that we use, as well as the statistics that we release from the data product. I'll note here that the standard disclaimer applies. Any opinions do not represent the views of the Census Bureau, and all the tables are public data that have been passed by the Disclosure Review Board. So to talk, where are we going in this webinar? We're going to talk first about what PSEO is, what specifically it measures for the second point, and then also how we create it. This is partly legal and also partly the data that we use to create this information. And then what's the future? What is it going to look like as we build PSEO and continue to increase the usefulness of the data product? All right, so PSEO is an experimental data product, and it's based on partnerships that we have with university systems, state higher education systems, and the Census Bureau. So we sign legal agreements with usually state departments of higher education, or in some cases, depending on governance, university systems. So our first partner was the University of Texas system. They came to us because they were interested in the earnings outcomes of their graduates, but they were only able to earn, they were only able to measure earnings for graduates that stayed inside of the state of Texas. The issue is that over time, more people leave the state of Texas as graduates move and find other opportunities, and that causes bias in the estimates of earnings. And so they wanted to be able to measure earnings at the national level. And so that was when the PSEO partnership was formed. We also added Colorado pretty soon after that. So we signed a legal agreement with the Colorado Department of Higher Education. And the goal was to measure earnings outcomes for all post-secondary graduates, not just at the baccalaureate and above, but also the sub-baccalaureate credentials that are given by post-secondary institutions. And the goal, the thing that we measure specifically is national earnings So earnings from all jobs in a calendar year, as well as employment counts. So earnings and employment, I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a second. And the goal for PSEO is to provide students, parents, institutions, and workforce agencies better data on the return on investment to post-secondary degrees, and then also the flow of graduates across the country. So there's very little information about where graduates go after they graduate, particularly by geography. And then also we publish information on employment by industry sector, which is really interesting, specifically as you look at different degrees that are aimed at specific industry sectors. You can see to what extent those individuals are actually being employed in those industry sectors rather than other ones. So the PSEO coverage, as mentioned earlier, currently we have 825 institutions that are post-secondary institutions in the data. As you can see from this map, anything that is blue is currently released data that you can go look at on the PSEO website, and I'll show you in a little bit how to look at that data. So the darker the blue, the more graduates we have from the institution or from that state. So, you know, in Michigan, we only have University of Michigan, and so it's light blue because there are plenty of other institutions in Michigan, whereas in Virginia and Texas and South Carolina, we have almost complete coverage of institutions. And in Virginia, it's the case that we have all private and public institutions. And so we are able to measure almost all of the graduates that come out of that state, right? And then Illinois is a state that we have data for, and we're working on releasing that data soon. And then also recently we signed a legal agreement with West Virginia. And so in the next version of this map, West Virginia will also be yellow because they'll have data pending. So what is it that PSEO measures? So there are two concepts that PSEO measures. The first one is earnings. So we look at the quantiles of earnings, the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile of annual earnings for these graduates. And then also employment flows. So we look at employment characteristics in two ways. We look at the employer location, which is the state of the employer, as well as the employer industry sector. We release the data right now at the Census Division level, but which is an aggregation of states, but below a region. But in the future, we plan on releasing things at the industry sector by state level. And so, you know, we're working on that specific enhancement. I'll talk a little bit later on in the webinar about that. These statistics are available not just at high levels, but at very detailed levels of aggregation. So they're available by institution, by degree level, by graduation cohort, which is groups of years of graduation, by the field of degree, down in most cases to the 4-digit classification of instructional program code, and then 1, 5, and 10 years after graduation. So snapshots of what your earnings are 1 year after graduation, 5 years after graduation, and 10 years after graduation. The idea behind that is that you could, that 5 years, that you can get a sense for both initial earnings for these graduates as well as sort of mid-career earnings 10 years after graduation in your mid-30s or early 30s, depending on when you're graduating. And we think that this is actually really important because this graph illustrates here that that while initial earnings have some information about the quality of the program, there are lots of programs that have similar initial earnings but very different 10-year outcomes. So you'll notice here the x-axis on this graph is the median earnings 1 year after graduation for University of Texas Austin graduates who graduated from 2001 to 2003 with a bachelor's degree. And you'll notice that there are a lot of, there's sort of this bunching of graduates at about $40,000 a year 1 year after graduation. Social work is there, health and physical education, English, journalism, history, psychology, radio, microbiology, immunology, etc. And you'll notice that if you just look at the 1 year outcomes, these programs look very similar. But if you look 10 years after graduation, this y-axis is the percent gain in the median earnings 10 years after graduation. And you'll notice that there is a large divergence between these programs as you go further on in your career. There are a few reasons for that. One is that some of these require additional training. And secondly, your first job is a very noisy indicator of your true earnings potential, given your training, because there's some matching process that happens that is imperfect. And the more you switch jobs, the better matches you receive. And so the 10-year earnings outcomes are more indicative sort of the overall quality of a degree, right? And so you'll notice here, the same is true here, that the difference between finance and registered nursing in general, they're earning about the same 1 year after graduation, but there's much less earnings growth for registered nursing versus finance, right? Because these are in very different earnings trajectory paths following graduation. You can look at this in a number of different ways as well. This is a graph of the different types of nursing degrees. So this is not just looking at bachelor's degrees. This is actually looking at associates and short certificate programs from a few institutions in Colorado. And you'll notice here, the less than 1 year certificate for Pikes Peak Community College, starts out at just over $20,000 and has some earnings growth. If you look at the 1 to 2 year certificate from Arapahoe Community College, from 1 to 5 years, there's actually large gains, and it actually catches up and passes the associates in nursing from Pikes Peak Community College. And so it's important as you look at the data, not just to compare across fields, but also across these degree levels, because there is some marked differences in terms of the earnings growth over time. And this graph helps to show that information, which I think is really helpful. So the main way that individuals interact with the data product is through the PSEO Explorer. So I like to joke that my job is to create CSV files, and it's someone else's job at Census, particularly another group inside of LEHD that builds these Explorer tools. And so I want to take you through a demo of how to use this tool. You can just Google PSEO Explorer. And I see there that Arlene provided a link to the Explorer website as well, so you can follow along if you want. So I'm going to switch, and you can see that we're at the PSEO Explorer homepage. And what I want to show first is you can decide that you are interested in an institution in Virginia. So let's select Virginia as a state. Then specifically, we're interested in the University of Richmond. And so we can either scroll all the way down, or you can search in this bar here, and you can say, you can just type in Richmond, and it'll give you University of Richmond. And then we're going to select two different broad degree fields. The first is business management, and the second is biological and biomedical sciences. And you can sort of see that there are large differences in terms of the starting salaries for these individuals. And then those differences persist over time. Although biology, this degree type catches up pretty considerably over time. But you may be interested in some subfield within business or within biology and biomedical sciences. And so you can break this out into all the programs that University of Richmond has that fall into these. And you'll notice that biochemistry is much different in that it actually has earnings of $101,000 10 years after graduation, whereas biology in general is about $8,000 less than that. And then that there are also these last three are different types of business degrees. You'll notice that human resource management is grouped in with business, but it actually has much different earnings outcomes than the other degrees or the other fields that you can study. Accounting has very large earnings growth, and then additionally, business administration has large earnings growth, but there's less earnings growth for human resources, and they're sort of permanently below the other business majors. So I think that's very interesting. You can also, if you're focused specifically on if you want to know something about the accounting majors. So we're going to focus just on accounting here. You can look right now, we've been looking at all cohorts for baccalaureate degrees, but if you're interested in specific cohorts, you can look first at 2004 to 2006 and see if they have what their earnings are. And then you can also compare that to 2007 to 2009 graduate years, which is them graduating during the Great Recession. It looks like despite graduating during the Great Recession, their earnings actually, their first year earnings were actually slightly higher than the previous years. And so that's, if you're looking for, if you're a student and you're thinking about degrees that may be less sensitive to recession times, you can sort of compare these graduates here. And then if you may also be interested not just in the median earnings, which is what this is showing, but you may also be interested in the percentiles of earnings, because one thing that's important to know is that the percentiles of earnings may show that there's a greater dispersion for some degrees versus others. So if we compare accounting and related services to business administration, and we look at percentiles 1 year after graduation, you can see here, accounting has a very tight distribution. So from the 25th to the 75th is only about $15,000. Whereas for business administration, the earnings are slightly lower, but it's also a much more wide distribution. So the 75th percentile in business is actually higher than accounting, but the 25th percentile is much lower. And so it gives you a sense for how broad the distribution is, which is helpful in terms of assessing the risk in choosing a particular field of study. So we may also be interested not just in whether these business majors are making money, but if we flip back here, we may be interested in where they're going and what types of businesses they're working for. So if we flip from the earnings, we can click on the flows, and you can see here business management, marketing, this large 2-digit SIP, which is the broad level, is how we release it. You can see that lots of these graduates are going to professional science and technical services, and then finance and insurance is the next largest industry sector. I'm going to flip this to shares so that you can see those shares and not have to do math in our heads. So about 62% of graduates go into these top 2 industry sectors, and then very few go into the rest of these. And then you can see how this changes over time. So 1 year after graduation, lots of them are there, and that top 2 shrink in 5 years after graduation, and then 10 years after graduation, they sort of filter into these other businesses as well, right? Because despite the fact that this is where lots of them start, they may, despite not changing occupations, maybe going into a different company that's sort of focused on a different industry sector, such as wholesale trade. You can also, if you want to, just look at the geography of where these individuals go. So University of Richmond has a large share of individuals leaving the state. So despite the fact that 37 of them go to or stay in Virginia, just about as many go to other parts or to the Mid-Atlantic, and then the South Atlantic balance is the next largest one, right? That changes over time. So 5 years after graduation, it actually flips. So Virginia is, you're less likely to be in Virginia 5 years after graduation, and then 10 years after graduation, it's sort of balanced out. You can also look at these together. So if we look at business management and then Virginia and then the industry, we could actually click and say, I want to focus just on people who stay in Virginia, and you can see the shares there. You can also say, I want to focus just on people that are in professional science and technical services, and you can click on that and see what the shares are. So one of the great things about this is that all of these things that I've been showing you, if you saw one of these and you said, wow, this is a really cool thing that I want to show my friend, you can just copy this URL. It's unique to the query that you're looking at, and then you can email it to someone in your program or someone else that you want to show cool data to, and you can share that URL, and they'll see exactly the same thing. If you're interested in downloading the data, you can also click here and it'll download the state that you're interested in or that you've selected, which in this case would be Virginia. So I'm going to toggle back now to the slides so that we can get back to the rest of the stop at 2:15. So how do we create PSEO? LEHD maintains a national database of jobs, which includes information, and a job is a link between an employer and an employee. So that means that we have lots of information about employers, their establishments, the industry that they're in, the location that they're in, as well as the employees, the demographics, and then also in this case, the education level variables. That enables us to measure earnings from these quarterly wages that we have from the jobs data, as well as employer characteristics. We use specifically industry sector and employment location. In the long term, there's actually a broad effort that's sort of above or upstream from PSEO, which is to create an integrated jobs frame that uses the unemployment insurance wage records, the W-2 records, the Schedule SE, so anyone that's self-employed, those records. And so the prototype of that is going to be done at the end of this current fiscal year, and then we're going to be ingesting it into PSEO soon thereafter. So we're looking forward to that because it'll enable us to update it. That dovetails beautifully into the next slide, which is the future of PSEO. So in PSEO 2.0, there are a number of large updates that we are undertaking. The first one is that we're going to be using those enhanced wage records. So we don't just want to measure stuff using the unemployment insurance wage records because we're missing lots of people. The active military is not in there. There's plenty of people that are not covered by unemployment insurance that we may want to measure. For instance, if you're an adjunct professor, you're not covered by unemployment insurance in the same way. And so we may not have, depending on the state, we may not have your earnings records. Additionally, we want to be able to measure people that are self-employed. This is particularly important if we look at businesses or like business majors that are focused on entrepreneurship, where we think that lots of those individuals are actually going and starting their own businesses. We can't see them because they're not collecting unemployment insurance, because you can't if you're the owner of a business. Additionally, we want to release earnings outcomes, not just by these degree field levels, but also by gender and race ethnicity, because this has been something that has been requested for a long time in PSEO, and we think is very important to sort of understand the extent to which earnings differ even within the same broad degree field and level. Right. Finally, the one that I specifically touched on earlier is the state by industry flows. So right now we just have a census division, institution state, and then the industry sector. If we had state by industry sector flows, that would enable us in a much more detailed way to see how graduates are moving across the country. Specifically, lots of states focus on the number of graduates they're losing. But this would give us information about the graduates that are coming into that state as well. And you could answer questions like, to what extent are the graduates we're losing being replaced by graduates that are coming in with similar skills, or their differentials in terms of the skills that we're importing versus exporting, and how do we think about that? We think it would be really helpful for workforce people, especially at the state level. And then in the immediate future, actually like 1.5 months or 2 months, we are going to be releasing state level aggregates, so you can answer questions like right now everything's at the institution level. So if I'll toggle, everything's at the institution level, so you can't answer questions like, of all the graduates that have bachelor's degrees, they got bachelor's degrees in Virginia, what share of them stayed in Virginia? You can't answer that question right now with the data. You could, but it's a little bit more complicated. So we're going to be releasing those state level aggregations where we can roll things up, because we think that that's a super easy lift for us, and also very interesting for other people. And so that should be that'll be coming soon, likely in mid-January. This last graph is one I want to highlight because it shows two of the issues that we want to address. The one issue that we address with with PSEO broadly, and then another one that we address with PSEO in the PSEO 2.0, including the self-employment. So this the diamond line, which is the second from the top here, is individuals that after they graduate, what share of them have only in-state unemployment insurance records. And you see it starts just under 70%, and it sort of declines about 10 percentage points to 15 percentage points 10 years after graduation. Even if you use all unemployment insurance, you actually that increases by about just under 20 percentage points. But the key here is it's still declining, right? One feature of this is that over time, self-employment actually becomes a more important part of the picture. And so 1 year after graduation, that bottom line is people that only have self-employment income. You'll notice that the bottom line of only self-employment income starts at a very small number. It's about 1%, but it grows over time and it gets up to about up to about 3 or 4%. If you look at people that get any self-employment earnings, that's actually also an important number because it measures the amount of earnings that we're missing currently. And you can see here that it starts at about 5% and it goes up to 10% by 10 years after graduation. And so there's a large share of individuals that are getting some self-employment earnings, and we just aren't capturing it currently in PSEO, but we want to, and that's one of the reasons why we want to enhance the wage records. So thank you so much for your time. I want to leave some time for questions. And so I will leave you with this. If you do have specific questions, either about the tool or about specific states and their status within PSEO, feel free to send an email to this email address. Lots of those emails get filtered to me, but we have a whole team of people that work on PSEO and on the LEHD things broadly, and they will field most of those questions as well. So thank you guys so much, and I'm going to pause here for questions.
All right, well, thank you, Andrew. And before we get to the questions, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy. Anthony has already put it in the chat. And again, please type all your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees. So Andrew, I'm going to roll 3 questions into one because they're kind of similar. But what is the process to have our institution and its 2-year system added to the data? Is it initiated by the Census Bureau or college system? How can institutions be added to the data? And how can we encourage our state to participate in the PSEO?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way it has worked historically and will probably continue to work is when a institution or a state reaches out to us, we begin negotiations. So there are 2 parts to this. The first is that we need to figure out whether the person that's approaching us actually is able to share all of the pertinent data. So there's sometimes where a single institution will reach out to us, and we'll encourage them to reach out to their whatever the governing body for the entire state is, because the fixed cost for us is these legal agreements that we have to sign and the data ingest infrastructure. And so the more institutions that we can cover by a single legal agreement, the better. And so we historically have not done any outreach to individual states. Those PSEO has sort of grown by word of mouth. And so if there are institutions or states that are interested, feel free to reach out using this email address, and we can start that process. The one caveat is that we have to have assent from the state labor market information office. The reason for that is because we have legal agreements that provide the unemployment insurance wage records to us. And so those states, a part of that legal agreement enables them to assent to the allowable use of their data for PSEO. And so that's almost never is that a sticking point. Usually it's just something that pauses that negotiation, but that's sort of the only other hoop we have to run through, and then we can start negotiations and get the MOU over the line and get the data in.
Okay, and there's one final question. Are we able to see geography broken down by rurality?
By rurality, like rural versus urban, is that the question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that would be cool. So there's the short answer is no. We only publish things at the state level. So and the reason for that is twofold. One is we know for certain that someone is employed inside of a state. So we don't have to use the unit to worker imputation for that. But secondly, we also the destination matrix is really sparse to begin with. And so if we went below the state level, it would be really difficult to actually protect the data in a way that would yield meaningful numbers for individuals. And so we actually we decided to stay at just the state level, which I know there's particular states where that's, there's large differences between rural and urban centers in terms of earnings and employment. But that's just not something that PSAO is able to handle. So that's a really good question, one that, in the future we may be able to address, but it would be a little bit harder to do.
Okay, with that, I have no more questions, so I'm going to hand it back to Linda.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to Andrew for his outstanding presentation. Andrew, would you like to make any closing remarks?
None for me. Just thank you so much for listening. And I do encourage you, if you have any questions or interest, please do reach out to us. We're always interested in expanding the partnership.
This concludes the 2023 LED webinar series for the year. Please join us next year as our 2024 LED webinar series kicks off on February 21st at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when the San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG Data Science team, presents Studying Workers' Travel Patterns to Employment Centers Using Census Data. Upon exiting this webinar, you will be asked to fill out an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so that we may better serve you with future webinars. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for making the 2023 LED webinar series a success. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for spending your year with us.
That concludes today's session. You may disconnect at this time. Have a great afternoon.